Oh yeah, awesome. So pleased to host Emily Chang tonight. Emily is a star reporter, I think it's fair to say, at Bloomberg for the last 8 years. There she's managed to launch 2 shows. It's now called Bloomberg Technology. It was Bloomberg West for a long time. And as well, she has a new show called Bloomberg Studio 1.0. She's written countless breaking news stories about some of the most salient issues in technology. And then most recently, she's made waves with her new book, Brotopia, breaking up the boys' club in Silicon Valley. Emily, to top it off, is the mother of 3 boys, and I'm told that you wrote this book while on maternity leave.
Partly. Just don't tell my boss that. Thank you.
So let's give it up with a warm Flexport welcome for Emily Chang.
Thank you.
So the way this is going to work, I'm gonna ask Emily some questions. We'll have a little dialogue and then I will leave plenty of time for questions at the end. What is your we got a hard stop at what time for you?
I can talk as long as you want.
Well, we don't want to keep you all evening, so I'll keep track of time and make sure we get plenty of time for you to ask Emily your questions directly. Okay. I have to tell you that I was pleasantly surprised in reading the book because I thought it was going to be all about recent scandals, but it's actually full of some really great original research and history in Silicon Valley. And one of the actually I pulled up this image because it was one of the things I'd never heard this story before, and I thought it was fascinating. Is this story? Can you tell us what this is that we're looking at right here?
I'm curious if anyone here has seen this photo before or seen it over the course of your studies in computer science. Okay. So this is the opening anecdote of the book, and this woman's name is Lena Soderberg. She is a Swedish Playboy model, and this is the centerfold from November 1972. So
this woman's naked.
She's naked in the full photo, but many of you who have probably seen it in your classes didn't realize that. So the story of Lena Soderberg goes back to a USC computer lab where they were doing the work that led to the JPEG, and it's actually the most prominent image processing lab in the country. And in 1973, they were looking for a photo to test their algorithm with. And just so happened there was a Playboy lying around the office because that wasn't weird or unusual. And the head of the lab said, why don't we just use a photo in there? There's some pretty nice looking pictures in there. And this photo went on to become the most popular photo used in image algorithm processing, and it is still used to this day. So we're talking about, if you worked on the iPhone camera, for example, you've seen this photo, Google Images, and the photo became sort of controversial in small circles, but no one really called attention to it or knew exactly how it ended up becoming so prominent. And Playboy, because everyone wanted to use the photo, Playboy licensed the photo so you could use it for free, and it's still in their main library of photos today. And I tracked down the professor who chose this photo for that test, and he told me that I was simply the first person to ever ask him about it. And he was like, look, I know about the controversy, but it wasn't sexist. There were no women in the lab at the time, so no one could have been offended. Well, it sort of kicked off this half century of passing the buck. It's not my problem. I didn't start this problem. I'm not responsible. This is just how it always has been. And I think it's been too many of those accidents and ignorant decisions that have led us to where we are. It's not necessarily the result of some malicious acts or intentions, but a series of accidents and unfortunate situations that have stacked on top of each other. But at this point, as I've written 300 pages about, ignorance can only be willful, in my view.
And it was interesting that one of the stats that stood out for me in the book was that in 1984, 40% of computer science graduates were female, and we're down to, I think it was 20% now.
So in 1984, the percentage of women in computer science peaked at 37%.
37%.
And it has since plummeted and been about 18% for the last decade.
And what is the big change? What exactly has changed?
So One of the most exciting parts of the book for me and the research that I did was learning about the history, because that's where I found what I thought was the real smoking gun. In the 1940s and 1950s, women actually played vital roles in the computer programming industry. Men were, more predominantly represented among, the people who made the hardware, but women actually were building the software. So they were programming computers for the military and programming computers for NASA. You can think about it like Hidden Figures, but industry-wide. And then as the industry was exploding in the 60s and 70s, they were desperate to find new talent. So they started doing these aptitude tests and personality tests, and these tests were widely shared among like fraternities and Elks Lodges. And a software company called STC, which is now part of the government, hired 2 psychologists to do a personality test and identify the qualities that made good programmers. And they decided that good programmers, quote, don't like people. So,
it's horrifying.
If you look for people who don't like people, the research tells us you'll hire more men than women. But also, there's no research to support the idea that people who don't like people are better at this job than people who do, or that men are better at this job than women. But these tests were widely used for decades by companies as big as IBM and helped perpetuate this idea of the antisocial, mostly white male nerd stereotype that many of us think of when we think of computer programmers to this day. And that stereotype has been repeated in TV and movies and classrooms by parents. And my argument is that the tech industry created this stereotype. Popular culture did not. And as such, the tech industry created the pipeline problem by creating a very narrow idea of who can be good at computers, if you will.
Yeah,
There is a pipeline problem, but the industry, I believe, is responsible for reinforcing it and has a lot of work to do.
The other thing that you said in your book was that there's this notion that to be good at computer programming, you have to be good at computer programming, that like you must have been born into it somehow. Yet we don't expect that necessarily of our doctors or our lawyers, where you've seen a lot more progress of women being the majority in those degrees.
So because the industry was so desperate for talent in the 70s and 80s, computer programming came to be seen as like a black art where you were born, not trained. So, the perception was that you must be like born with these skills or the ability to do this or some natural inclination to do so, which, I think we would generally believe is not true, but unfortunately this stereotype or this sort of toxic assumption has been widely held to this day by people like James Damore. And really the same argument that Damore was making, that men are more biologically suited to do this job than women, is the same lazy argument that those psychologists made 50 years ago.
Yeah, and
I disagree with him. If you couldn't tell, I'm happy to discuss why. But
me too. So when you're writing, mentioned James Damore, and one of the other things that stood out here. So you have this great historical aspect with really well researched, interesting parts of history of women in computer programming and computer science, and then but like this great juxtaposition of all this really recent stuff. Like how did you write the book that fast? I feel like things that were in there were just like a couple of months old.
It took me 2 years, but like the story really just exploded when I was supposed to be turning in the book.
Like while you were writing it.
And my editor was like, we need to get this printed now because like this is Me Too, it's all happening now. And I'm like, but it's happening now. Like I need to write about this. And I think my publisher wanted to kill me because I was like, I cannot turn it in yet. I'm not done. No.
So wait, you were already, okay, that makes a lot more sense.
And
so you were
I
already
literally
writing.
Turned it in, and I'm pretty sure they like sprinted to the press.
What was the original?
The printing press.
What was the original vision for the book then, if it wasn't inspired by a recent scandal? How did it change?
The vision for the book was, why have women been left out of the greatest wealth creation in the history of the world? Which in 2015, when I decided to write this book, was still the case. I mean, women, they have 25% of jobs across the industry. Women account for 7% of venture investors and get 2% of venture capital
as founders
funding. And the actual spark that sort of lit the fire that gave me the motivation to write the book was an interview that I did with Mike Moritz, who is the chair of Sequoia Capital. And this was in November 2015, when at the time, Sequoia had no female investors in their US investing business. And I said to him, what do you think your responsibility is to hire women? And this is a question that I've asked many investors and CEOs over the years. So and no one ever says what they no one ever says what they really think on camera. When you ask them this question, they give you the politically correct answer. And so when I asked him this question, I expected some sort of canned answer about how they think women are important and they're trying hard to find them. And instead, what he said to me is, we're looking very hard, but unfortunately not enough women are studying computer science. And really what we're not prepared to do is to lower our standards. And that set off like a firestorm of controversy in the media. And
Mike Morris was a journalist, if I recall.
Mike Morris was a journalist.
Scientist.
He was not a computer scientist, and he's like arguably one of the best venture capitalists ever. I mean, he invested in Google, for example, Yahoo, and had a very unconventional background, which you would think that might lead him to believe that maybe we should change the idea of who can be good at this job.
So that's what set off the book. And then as you're writing it, like scandal starts unfolding and you just had to write furiously to...
Yeah, so for the first, so some of these scandals were like Justin Colbeck, for example. His behavior was kind of an open secret. So he was one of the first people that I started to pursue, but nobody wanted to talk. I talked to so many women who had bad experiences with him, and at the time, nobody wanted to come forward, and so
like speak on the record about it.
And speak on the record. And let's see, Trump got elected, which was a surprise, even to him, and I think a lot of women were furious and felt emboldened, and I think some of the activity that we're seeing is a response to Trump being elected, but also there is more to it. And it was in 2000, it was 2 months after Trump got elected, or 3 months after Trump got elected, that Susan Fowler's blog post hit. And then it was a few months after that the Justin Colbeck story ended up being written by The Information, which was it was an incredible story, and it really sort of set the standard for how these stories would be told. If we are going to expose people who are behaving badly, what does it take? How many on the record versus on background accounts does it take to get that story over the line? And it sort of opened the floodgates for more women to come forward and tell their stories. And the New York Times did some stories. Bloomberg has done some stories. And so over the course of my reporting, like literally in the last 6 months, everything started accelerating. And I certainly benefited from that momentum and women summoning their collective courage to speak up.
And so where do you think, how much of the vision changed for the book as this came about?
To be honest, I had no idea what I was doing when I started. I had no idea what this was going to look like. And it really sort of came together along the way. I know that sounds hard to believe, but I didn't have an outline. I'd sort of pull stuff together and think, oh, this could be a chapter. And then, it just sort of crystallized over time. I think if you sort of set out with a very specific idea of what you want to do, maybe it's not worth a book because you already know the answer. I started out not knowing the answer to a lot of these questions. And really, I didn't have an agenda. I wanted to report the truth. I knew that it might make some people uncomfortable, but I also knew that it wasn't worth doing if I didn't report what I really believed needed to be said.
And it's really interesting because another great part about the book is your access to tech luminaries. Not to flatter you too much as a reporter, but it was really interesting to hear. And it's probably good that you started writing the book before a lot of the scandal, because you're able to get people to talk about sensitive subjects on the record that a year later they might have been. It starts to make sense now. I'm how did you get these eminent folks to come on the record and say, sometimes put their foot in their mouth as they were talking to you? And have you noticed people be more defensive about being willing to talk to you since it came out? And
so I'm sure there's some people in the book who will never talk to me again.
Oh.
It's okay. I have a day job, and my job depends on having relationships with people who want to come on the show. And so I didn't embark on this endeavor lightly. But I think that I was pretty fair. And for the people that I was hard on, I really haven't heard anything from them. And so I think if they really had a bone to pick with it, or if they felt it was unfair, then I would have heard. But these are very prominent people who are used to being in the spotlight. And I think, in the case of Mike Moritz, they didn't hire a woman. So regardless of what he said, right? Maybe it was a stupid comment. Maybe he didn't mean it exactly that way. if you judge Sequoia just on its actions and not its words, they would fail the loosest diversity tests because they didn't hire a single woman in their U.S. investee business in 44 years.
Until like 6 months after your interview.
Yes. So you can't tell me that the best venture capital in the world can't find one woman to work there. I mean, like, I don't buy that.
Right.
And so, yes, they hired Jess Lee. I think she's fabulous. I've spoken to people there who do seem to care, but we need a lot more action and a lot less talk.
Yeah. Well, one of the companies I thought you were fair to, but also a tough one, was Google. Not to pick on them, because as you're right, like, they've made a lot of effort in this. I think you said that you'd give them an A for effort and a C for results. Like, what do you think? And if you look at the stats, they have kind of right in the mean of diversity statistics for women in engineering in particular, but across the company. Where did they go off, or like, what are the programs were ineffective or counterproductive, perhaps?
So Google was one of the hardest chapters to write because it's such a huge company, and I feel like everyone in the Valley has worked at Google at some point in their career, and so there were so many inputs and viewpoints to consider, and I just didn't want to get it wrong. But what I found in reporting what happened at Google is that in the early days, Larry and Sergey actually really cared about hiring women, and they brought in, Susan Wojcicki and Marissa Mayer and Sheryl Sandberg, and they were explicit about, Marissa was like going to be the 8th person at the time, and they were like explicit about, you're going to be our first woman. We think it's really important to get strong women in here early. And look what happened. I mean, these women like Susan Wojcicki, conceived the entire ad business. Marissa Mayer, designed the user interface, the minimalist user interface that we all use to this day. Sheryl Sandberg scaled the ad business. And when Google started out, there were like 14 other search engines. I think we sort of think, oh, Google was just the best, and they were the first to future, and their success was a guarantee. But when they started out, their success was far from a sure thing. And it was certainly the triumph of a lot of people, but I think these 3 women don't get the credit that they deserve. But it also goes to show that this isn't just, hiring women and isn't just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. And they helped turn Google into the unassailable business that it is today. Where they went wrong is that over the years, they simply lost focus, and it stopped being a priority. And the fact that they believed in it stopped being communicated down through other different managers at the organization. And as they were exploding in size, they were just trying to hire people so fast. They were looking for reasons not to hire people. I mean, Google they became like sort of elitist at the same time as they really needed people. And they defaulted to the sort of same industry hiring methods, the same job fairs, the same, hiring practices that everybody else uses. And when they sort of picked their heads up at the end of the financial crisis, this is what, a senior HR person at Google told me. They were like, F, like, where are all the women? Like, what happened? And their numbers are depressingly average, just like everybody else.
Yeah, and the scale of the companies is great. Like, I was reading the stats, so I might get the math wrong, but it's like they have 77,000 employees, 64,000 of them are engineers. So that means if I did the math right, there's 12,000 female engineers at Google, which on the surface you're like, wow, that's badass. Like, that's a great cohort of female engineers. It makes me feel like, how come we can't convince 100 of them to join Flexport? There's 12,000. So, but you do.
Because they're paying everyone lots and lots of money.
I'm aware. So another chapter that actually I think really spoke to me was your writing about PayPal and the early PayPal mafia, which was almost, I think, all male and all hired from each other's friends, and they took great pride in it, that they hired their friends and then the friends of all the other friends that they hired. And it was a friends network, which in your book they defend as, we were friends with all the smartest people and we were outcasts or something. But the reason this spoke to me is that I too hired a couple of my friends. I don't know if I did that consciously following their lead or not, but early on, and I don't regret it. My friends helped build this business along with a lot of other great people here. But one of the reasons I invited you today was that I know that there are women at Flexport who think that we don't do enough to empower women here. I know because some of them have told me this. And I wanted to ask you, like, what are some companies that do a really good job in this? Who are the leaders? Who should we be learning from as we seek? I want to commit to doing better on this in this area. And who should I be learning from?
So first of all, I'm so grateful that I'm here, and I'm like, I think being open to having me speak with my book being called Brotopia, it just shows me that you're very open-minded. And so I appreciate that. And so I think being willing to listen to people like me is a first step. The book isn't entirely depressing. There are bright spots in the book. There are people doing some incredible things. Nobody has it completely figured out, because if they did, like, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this. I talk about, I really, in the last chapter, I really like dive deep into solutions, and I focus on Slack and Stuart Butterfield, who has made hiring and promoting women and underrepresented minorities a very explicit priority. And every time he tweets about it, they get a spike in inbound interest. So just saying that you care attracts people who also care. Now, you can't just say you care. You have to actually care and do things, to live up to that every single day. There are so many, like, detailed and prescriptive solutions. But some of the things that they have done is, it's like, setting a strong set of cultural values at the very beginning and making sure, like, that you write those values down and that they aren't biased. So, if your values are meritocracy and stepping on toes, like Uber, you may end up in trouble someday. But if you think
stepping
a
on
bit
toes
more collaboratively,
wait, stepping on toes was an official value?
Right, about your values, it was an official value.
What does that mean?
Always be hustling was another. It's
Okay.
not even, like, grammatically correct, but
Stepping on toes is just a recipe for people being annoying
I think
at
the
work.
idea was, do whatever it takes to get the job done. Now, do you roll over people in order to do that? I don't think you would necessarily agree that you should. It's like, move fast but don't rush. That's one that I could support.
Yeah.
And so we talk a lot in the Valley about culture fit, which I think is, like, kind of an insidious term and can be used to dismiss people that just aren't like you, or maybe you don't like to drink beer like you. I like the term cultural addition. So when you're bringing new people in, you believe in your culture and you want someone who's gonna, add to your culture, but also sort of expand your culture. Amplify your culture. And I do think that these are some things that you can find out about people in the interview process. These are our values. What do you believe in? Give me an example of when you've lived up to that
I always
value.
like to ask people why they came to Flexport and see if it's because of our mission and the problems that we're working on, instead of, like, the dollar value of the market.
Some of the things that Slack did
Shouldn't
is
have
they
said that
added
on a
this
secret,
stuff.
on a public video.
They added this stuff to their job description. Their motto is work hard and go home. People aren't playing ping pong, and I don't know if you have a ping pong table, but people aren't playing ping pong after hours and, like, drinking beer every
I've
night.
banned ping pong because of the loud noises that it makes. I like ping pong, actually, but it's obnoxious to play it at work.
But they've diversified their recruiting teams. Okay, Slack's done a lot of things, and generally, I interviewed Joelle Emerson, who is she founded Paradigm, and they're a company that's trying to coach a lot of tech companies on, how to build diverse teams. And her main thing is that if you just focus on raising awareness about bias, it's not going to have a ton of impact. So, you could all come here and listen and, oh, that's great, I learned some stuff, but it might not necessarily change your behavior, because it's really hard to change we all have biases and we don't always realize them. But if you give employees the tools to combat bias, that can have impact. So say you don't even start an interview process until you have 2 qualified female candidates or candidates of color. Of course, that's going to require some patience and some other kinds of sacrifices, but my argument is that it'll pay off in the longer run. And it might take you 3 weeks to hire the first white guy that you see. It might take 3 months to hire a woman, but in 3 years, you'll be grateful that you gave it that amount of time. Dick Costolo, for example, when he left Twitter, when he started his new company, he wouldn't hire another man until he'd hire a woman. So it was 50-50. And it actually made things faster, because they didn't have to, when they were, discussing a new feature, they didn't have to, go outside the office to do user research and talk to women on the street about what they thought. They could just ask people who were in the room. And if you look at companies that do have female leadership, like Stitch Fix or Rent the Runway or Eventbrite, they're 50-50. So just having strong female role models, that feeds on itself.